All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I am chatting with someone that I should have had on for a really long time, and I wanted to have him on for a really long time, but I just never got around it, and there were just a lot of potential stuff that I felt like I could have talked about with this person. And lately, I've been just binge listening to a lot of podcasts that he has done. And finally, an actual podcast episode started to formulate in my head that I felt like, damn it, I could do this episode with this guy. And so I took the courage, reached out to him, and he was kind enough to agree. So I'm chatting with Dr. Scott Stevenson, who is a scientist, bodybuilder, and just overall great thinker about training, nutrition, and lots of other topics. So, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Absolutely, Abel. It's funny because I sometimes I consider myself kind of a bit of a podcast whore, and I think you first contacted me after I had a week where I did 4 podcasts, almost literally one every day, and that's probably nothing. I know there are people who are in much higher demand, but I literally I should be careful of saying this, but I literally say yes to almost every podcast because it's a chance to
Mm.
reach out and maybe influence, if it's just one person, that hears something that I say that gets a light bulb to go off or makes a positive change in their life and their training, whatever it may be, then it's absolutely worth it. So, but yeah, you caught me after a string. There was it was I think I had maybe 5 or 6 podcasts that were all sort of new all at once because some had taken some time to come out, and then mine came out, and 3 of the ones that I'd done in the span of a week came out. So it seemed almost like, how can this guy be doing this? But that's probably what I probably fed your binge a little bit during that week.
Yeah, yeah, and part of the challenge for me was that a lot of people, it's very easy to kind of pin them down to one particular topic, and it's like, well, I haven't done a podcast episode about that. It's kind of a straightforward decision to reach out to that person to, okay, like this could be a good way to address that topic. But I've heard you talk about so many different topics on different podcasts that I couldn't really decide like what would be the best thing to actually chat about. And I don't want to ask you like just introduce yourself to people because probably 99% of my audience will know who you are. So it's kind of like maybe I should introduce myself before you kind of thing. Let's just start with where you are in terms of what's going on in your life. I heard you competed recently and you've just been through some rough dieting times. So how are you doing on that front?
Actually, it's funny. I'm not sure who told you they were rough. They haven't been that bad. Dieting is pretty easy for me. I mean, I've been at this for a while. I'm coming up on. I mean, if you round it up, I'm at almost 4 decades of training in the gym. I'm competing for well over 2. So it's very easy for me to get into a groove. So I wasn't planning on competing, but the circumstances sort of lent themselves to doing so. So I had to do a warm up show, and I did 2 national level shows. And for me, these are, I mean, I know my limits. I learned many years ago that, I'm not, and a lot of this came actually from training with Dave Henry, IFBB Pro Dave Henry. We were training partners for the better part of a decade. So I gained some good perspective on what my genetic abilities are. Literally having coached Dave and trained with Dave and seen like it's not a matter of days out working me or out eating me or what have you. There's just certain things that put a limitation on how good we can be. But so I've always viewed competitions as sort of the endpoint of an experiment or the endpoint of a learning process for me that is basically most valuable because of the actual journey per se rather than the destination. So I had a chance to compete, so I started sort of playing around. I got down into the legitimate stage level body fat percentages and just kind of stuck with it. I messed around with my peak week protocol. I've got my latest book, sort of my master brain dump thus far is it's called Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. And I've got it's about 15-page section in there on how I've constructed peak week, sort of in a basic sequential way for people to, if they even need to do one, to do that without pharmaceutical diuretics. It's based on physiological science of water manipulation, electrolytes, et cetera, et cetera. So, but there's various ways you can kind of come at that, and I have that in the book. And I just tried out some different things. So that was like one aspect of the self-experimentation that I did. And I was dieting down, and one of the things I don't do people want to sometimes kick me when I say this, is I really don't do formal cardio. I did it many, many years ago. It just withered up my legs. Whenever I've kind of done that, I've noticed that's the case. I walk my dogs a couple times. So that's sort of my cardio, but you really we're not talking of any exertion whatsoever. But what I do is I keep myself very busy with projects. I've had a bunch of projects that have kept me busy, and literally we're talking about the kind of thing that probably most people wouldn't want to do. Like recently, I installed a ranch hand bumper on the front of my 9 F350. It's an old beater truck, and it's like a 250 pound bumper. And so you can imagine, I get into there under my creeper, and I'm underneath, and I'm trying to wrench off these 20-year-old screws, and I got rust falling in my eyes, and I'm out in the Florida sun. This is not easy work. It's fun. It's enjoyable for me. Completely, I'm not thinking about eating. I'm not sitting there like, counting the minutes to my next meal. It's very, very easy for me, at least. This is what I found, to pick enjoyable projects like this, to sort of engage my creativity. It's like, okay, how am I gonna get these screws off here? And this is not going to work because that part of the truck is rusted out. So I'm gonna have to figure out another way to attach this that's going to give it the the mechanical integrity it needs as a bumper, et cetera, et cetera. So I've got an intellectual task that keeps me occupied that also expends a lot of energy. So with the things that I'm doing here at home, I've got a truck camper I'm putting on the F350. I've had a million and one things that have literally made that energy expenditure side of the pre-contest equation a no-brainer. Actually, kind of the opposite. It's engaged my brain so much, it's made it very, very easy to do. So at one point, I'm like, you know what? This is actually going so well. And I think I did post this on Instagram a few weeks ago. I got down to, I figured what would happen. I wondered if I could actually make it down to the weight limit for classic here in the amateur ranks in the States, BC. And because I normally would compete, normally weigh in, depending on when the weigh-in caught me in terms of like dropping water, et cetera, but somewhere around 215, and I'm 5'8". So that's, middle of the heavyweight range. And at 5'8", it's either 185 or 190 is the weight I have to weigh. And that's in good condition. I get on stage in decent shape, and I'm thinking there's no way I can possibly make it there. I've seen, but I've always seen some of the physique pros. They look like they literally defy gravity in some way. It's just they've got hollow bones or something that allows them to make weight. So I just stuck with this, my diet and kept on trying to bring myself down. I got to about 207, and there's just nothing there. I mean, literally, I could not move. And I'm like, if I tried to drop 17 pounds or 18 pounds, whatever it might have been, it would have not looked very good on stage. You can always drop some water and then fill back up, but it would have been just literally dropping 7 or 8 of muscle for the sake of just making that weight class, and it wouldn't have behooved. So I got to test that. This is what I like to do as a bodybuilder, sort of as I tinker, and this adds to my knowledge base that I can books, is I sort of like, I test out the terrain, the territory. And that was a way that I had never gone before. I mean, bodybuilding is about getting as gigantically, massively muscular as possible, right? You want to be just this walking human eclipse with 0% body fat, veins everywhere. And, but it's also very cool to be very, very, very just really, really, really lean. But if you don't have the structure, at some point in time, you end up looking stringy, of course. So that's kind of where I was going. But I tested it out. That's someplace I'd never been. That's someplace I didn't think I would go. So I'm like, well, guess what? I haven't gone down that road. I'm going to give it a shot. So I got to do that. And that was just like, it was really kind of cool and fun for me to find, like, that's kind of a big avenue. Like, that's a lot of people do that. They try to, they diet down to try to fit one of the newer divisions to get their pro card or what have you. And none of that really matters to me. But it was really kind of cool and exciting to say, okay, I'm going to give this a go. So, for about 6 weeks or so, I just kept on kind of pushing. And I realized that, okay, I'm not at that weight limit, but to get there, like there's a pit of molten lava, and my legs, I would be legless by the time I got there, and I need my legs at the end point there, so that was why I ended up competing so much, was just sort of, I was in contest shape. And I also wanted to get a national qualification. And I wasn't placing high enough. It was kind of there's bodybuilding is not highly populated in the local shows here. So I had to do a couple shows before I could place top two. It's bizarre. It's a bizarre scenario. That's a whole other topic. But so I just did a couple local shows. I got to meet some local guys, which I wouldn't have otherwise. So it was
Yeah. No, that's really cool that you were able to frame a dieting process to very lean levels as a form of experimentation and something that was actually fulfilling, and you didn't let that whole process kind of eat into your life and make everything else miserable, which I guess what ends up happening to a lot of people. So I guess more power to you in that case. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, obviously, and this is kind of become trite to say this, but we choose to do this to ourselves. This is these are not being able to eat carbs because you're dieting for a bodybuilding show is an absolute first world issue. Like, it's not like you could always, like, there's plenty of carbs. It's not like you're being forced into this because you live in abject poverty or what have you. You're homeless or something like that. This is a total choice. So, of course, sometimes it's like, okay, I'm pretty hungry right now. I got done and I calmed down and I'm back in the air conditioning. I'm like, I could eat. I really could eat some food now. But I just, I realized that, hey, I want to see what happens here. So it's always been my choice. And I've got I've accumulated some strategies, of course, to psychological strategies like that, like literally being mindful of the greater picture. It's very, very important. Literally reflecting back, saying, I am really friggin'. I mean, how tough is this? Literally, I've come in from outside. I'm working on getting a truck and a camper up so that I can take a kind of a road trip. I'm going to do some seminars, ideally, once I finally get the contraption where it's safe to travel in. And I'm out in the heat. It's hot. It's sweaty. And I'm choosing not. I mean, this is like a fantasy world for many people and the vast majority of human beings in the course of human history so far, who've many of whom have had to struggle just to stay alive. Living beyond the age of 30 was a luxury just a couple centuries ago. So this is awesome. Like, I got no room to complain. So, and I've also got all the things available to me. I can use, like, artificial sweetened drinks, like low calorie drinks, Crystal Light types things, drink lots of water, plenty of fruits and vegetables around, high fiber. There's all sorts of things that I can do to sort of tease that hunger away. I have 3 dogs, I can afford to have 3 dogs. There's just absolutely no reason. This didn't, come into my head the very first time I dieted many years ago. I had a different perspective, but even then, it's like, this is kind of cool. Let's see what happens here. Let's see what my body can do. Let's tinker. So that's really fun for me.
Yeah. I think it's good to put things into perspective every once in a while. I mean, I've gotten leaner than I've ever been before. I mean, it's nothing compared to probably the condition that you've gotten down to, but it's all relative to where you are in the moment.
Relative, yep.
And every once in a while, I had to kind of have this self-talk with myself that, well, I'm on low calories and I'm hitting the gym and I'm keeping my physical activity up consciously, but and it's getting tough. But man, like, imagine in like a concentration camp or something where people had to work for like literally all day long in the cold with no clothes, with like guns at their heads. They were like very close to death in terms of how skinny they were. I mean, compared to that, it's still nothing.
Right. Have you read Viktor Frankl's A Man's Search for Meaning?
No, not yet. I know it's a must read.
Yeah, I mean, basically that points to everything, like literally the example that you gave, being in a concentration camp, and how that basically brought up about within him the perspective that he shares in the book about what the meaning of life is. So yeah, that's a definite reader for pretty much everybody.
Cool. So that was a short or not so short preamble. And, a couple of months ago, I was literally like every other video on my YouTube channel and on my podcast, every other episode was about training volume and the high volume studies of Brett Schoenfeld and this and that. And I've gotten so sick of that topic that literally whenever someone even brings that study up or that whole volume topic up or asks me about my training split and how many sets I do, I'm just like, man, just please leave me the hell alone. Like, I don't want to think about it. And I pretty much throw that whole topic into the category of topics that I would frame as mental masturbation topics. But I thought that if there is a person that I would be willing to engage in that mental masturbation with for one last time, that would be you.
You're saying I'm basically your favorite porn star in the mental masturbation arena of high volume training.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we can do that, man.
And first of all, like just to stay on that theme of mental masturbation and whether it is actually mental masturbation or is just my kind of perception. I've heard a recent giant podcast that you guys did with my gosh, I'm blanking on his name, Brendan Carter.
Paul, Paul Carter.
Paul Carter, yeah, excuse me. So, and a question was addressed to both of you guys that why do you think it is that the natural training crowd is so fond of obsessing over so many details and so many minute stuff that might not even make that much of a difference. Like, should I be doing 18 sets a week per muscle group, or should I be doing 15 or 21? And you had a really cool response to that. But I want to ask that same question of you on this podcast again, because I'm curious, maybe you've been thinking about it since then, or whether you're going to give the same response. So why do you think that is?
It's funny that we recorded that podcast maybe a couple months ago. I don't even remember being asked the question, but also you've got me in a perfect position because I'm essentially regenerating a response from a blank slate. I think that obviously gains come much more slowly to natural trainees, so it's not an easy task to get to the point where from many, maybe even the average person who puts a lot in, and even if you look at some of the best natural pros, if they're in street clothes when they're dieted down, unless you happen to notice the vascularity in their forearms or what have you, you might not even know that they lift. And that's not in any way a put down to natural competitors, just the amount of muscle mass that can be obtained naturally, in many cases, not everyone, without or so that it shows in an average everyday way, is so much less for most people when they're not training enhanced, that there's a just natural human proclivity to try to focus on dotting every I and crossing every T to make sure you can figure out everything. So because it just doesn't come that easy. So I think that's probably a large part of it. And I mean, there's probably a different personality type too. Is this what I said before? I really have no idea.
Similar, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think there's a different personality type as well that comes along with being a natural trainee, and that they're maybe a little bit more conservative, possibly. Someone who is just, goes at life with reckless abandon. You can think back to maybe friends that you went to school with years ago, or people that you know now that they just go for it. They're altering their state of consciousness is just part of day-to-day life, be it with drugs or some sort of extreme behavior. It's part of a normal the natural human mind. There's a alternative sort of holistic medical practitioner named Andrew Weil. He's pretty well known in the alternative medicine world. He's an MD, but he was involved with psychedelics many years ago, and he wrote a book called The Natural Mind. And the basic thing that he posits in the book is that it's natural and normal to want to change our state of consciousness. Kids, spin around in chairs when they're young and do daredevil types of things, and people jump out of airplanes and want to drive their cars really quickly. And drug use in some way, shape, or form is basically part of every culture known to man historically. So some people tend to do that more so than others. So if you think of sort of a spectrum of just like going in and going for broke and just being like an animal and just not caring about pain, not caring if you're bleeding, not to say that there aren't natural trainees who train this way as well. I've seen them, I've trained with some of them, and there's some absolute friggin' badasses who aren't geared up. Doug Miller's one guy for him. You watch that guy deadlift, pull up. I think he's got a 30 rep deadlift set on YouTube that's just like mind boggling. He's a machine. So, but generally speaking, there's probably you could probably differentiate some psychometrically the mentality that folks have. So you're going to have people who are like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not something that, it's just like a little too extreme. There's too many unknowns. I want to capture things that I can know, and I'm going to focus on those things. So those people will tend to be more micromanaging of the factors that they know that they can control. I mean, when you have reams and reams of research that you can read through every night and dig into, that sort of propels that perspective that there's some sort of an answer. There's so much out there. As you know, this is all about the mental masturbation, that, you know, if you can get kind of addicted to it, kind of like you could to internet porn. You know, literally you start thinking like this, there's got to be something to this. There's just so much material here that there must be an answer there. And it's just a matter of finding it. And that's, I mean, so much of the fitness industry as well, this goes for trained or geared up or natural competitors, is about magic bullets. It's absolutely amazing to me that sort of take on selling stuff through ads, where like this is the next thing that'll just turn you into Ronnie Coleman, still works. It's literally, it still attracts people. And I think this has always been my hypothesis, is that we're tend to be gullible in many ways, but when it comes to something that is so central to our ego, our body and our body image, which you walk into any room and I've talked to bodybuilders who, like, literally this is really almost why they bodybuild. Like they've almost pointed out this. They love to walk in a room and get attention because they're gigantic. They look unusual. So your body image and your ego and literally your sense of self, for many, many people, is, especially in Western culture, is very, very wrapped up in the physique, in your body image. So bodybuilders are the extreme of that. So if you give them information, or you give them try to sell them a supplement, or you give them information related to training or whatever that might perhaps have an uncovered hidden treasure in there somewhere in terms of the right amount of volume, like that sweet spot where all of a sudden the gains just sort of take off, then people will search for that. There are treasure hunters. I don't have a TV, but I know there have been shows of people like that are treasure hunters, and literally they'll spend years like looking for treasure, thinking they're going to hit the jackpot. And that's what gambling is about. You gamble and gamble and gamble. Like, people go into the in the casinos, and they know that the house is stacked against them. Like the house, obviously the casino wouldn't be there if they continue to lose money to the people who are the customers of the casino. But the people still go in there knowing it's a losing proposition. So there's so many, you could go on and on and on, but there's so many aspects of human nature, and combine that with the fact that you probably got a different psychology in the natural trainees, and and it's related to their body. And natural trainees aren't as large on average as those who are geared up. Obviously, there's an effect there. So all those things can kind of focus that tendency to want to micromanage various aspects of the bodybuilding equation, the formula, and the training volume is a huge one. I mean, Brad Schoenfeld's doing wonderful stuff. It's really pretty cool, I think, to have someone like Brad, who is a researcher. I believe he's full professor now. He's legit. He's the real deal. And he's also really well known among kind of your average person in the bodybuilding world. If they pay attention whatsoever to anything on the sciencey side of things, they know who Brad is. That's awesome. So when Brad's doing a volume study like that, people are going to just take that, and we tend to idolize, and they see the information that comes out of that, which we idolize and we simplify both. And like you say, okay, this must be it. Like, the God of hypertrophy has spoken. And I'm not in any way like Brad. I doubt he'll listen to this, but Brad knows I'm not picking on him whatsoever. I'm sure he senses this all the time in the messages and the way that people interact with him, that they want to take what he has to say and use it too much. And he was actually on a podcast that Paul and Alan Aragon and I had for a little while. And one of the things about that volume study, which you may have heard this, I don't know if this topic came up.
Actually, sorry to interrupt, but do you have a podcast yourself? Because I was trying to find it.
Muscle Minds. Yeah,
you're Muscle.
I have my own. Yeah, I have my own podcast. Oh gosh.
Oh,
here comes the binging. Yeah.
Oh goddamn.
Yeah, the other one is called the Swoley Trinity, and that's that one is no more. But these are all on the Think Big podcast network. It used to be Advices Radio, so you can find it either way. But yeah, I think I've got like 70 some episodes.
Oh, that's amazing. Oh,
been doing it for a few years.
My schedule is full for the next week then.
You got cardio material for the rest of the year easily.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the things we dug into that study, one of the things that Brad said, and this is kind of difficult to grasp to some degree, if you haven't really dug into and thought about the science a lot, is that the nature of that volume study, as Brad explained it, and I don't mean to speak for him, and hopefully I'm explaining this the way that he would approve of, but was not to create practical recommendations in terms of training volume per se, but rather to explore that upper end of training volume, where there is little literature examining the sort of dose response of training volume and hypertrophy. So that's why they did that study. It's like, okay, there was an old meta-analysis and a review as well, I think, and they developed this idea of the dose response of training volume. And beyond like 9 sets or 10 sets, they didn't really have enough studies to create a meaningful conclusions as far as what effect it would have on muscle growth to do more sets than that. They gave an effect size and there was an effect, but literally there's kind of if you look at the sort of the span of the studies, the higher volume ranges, there's the paucity of evidence. So he just wanted to explore that, not say this is what everyone should do. So it was more of almost like a basic research question rather than a practical applied research question. And almost all the studies, literally you don't see research studies with resistance training that really are, there's never going to be a perfect one, but you typically, obviously you see the untrained individuals, and there's obviously issues there because they're so sensitive to the stimuli of muscle growth that almost anything will get the muscle to grow. There are old studies from the 50s and 60s. You can put on fat-free mass just from running. If you're an untrained person, just jogging classes with college students will put on fat-free mass. So just about anything will do it. But the studies aren't optimizing other aspects of the training intentionally because they're trying to like just isolate one variable. And if they tend to try to optimize everything all at once, then they lose the power of changing that one variable in a way that could seem just sort of simple and idiotic, but they definitely don't want to do that because it doesn't help them answer the research questions that they have. So
it's interesting for me why it's such a sexy topic, training volume, because or even in the natural realm, there are a lot of potentially more interesting topics or sexy topics like supplements. But I think the evidence-based crowd largely understands that most supplements just won't do magic, or none of them will do magic. Creatine and caffeine coming the closest, but even that, those are kind of meh in their effects. So I think that the reason why the topic of training volume is so sexy is because that is one realm where I think people feel like they have a direct control over what happens with their progress. Like if someone just tells you, look, just put weight on the bar over time and over a couple of years, put 20 to 50% extra weight on your 10RM on the bench press. It's like, yeah, well, that sounds good, but man, like that's going to take me months and years. But doing another set or another couple of sets, that's something I can do instantly. It's just like, oh, so that's the secret. I should just do 20 sets instead of 12, and I can make substantially faster gains. Like, let's do that tomorrow. Do you think that's what's going on there? Hey guys, just a second. Are you enjoying this podcast? If so, I'd really appreciate you dropping a 5-star rating on the Sustainable Self-Development Podcast on iTunes. That will help me to grow this podcast, rank higher on the platform, and get more high-quality guests over time, which is a win-win for everybody. So if you could do this little bit of favor for me, I'll owe you one. Thanks a lot, guys, and let's continue.
Oh, there's so much there. That's it. You're opening the can. Each can of worms you open is bigger and bigger. Absolutely. So there's so much there. What you said actually applies to the reason for examining volume in the scientific perspective. And I've addressed this before, and I've heard it addressed a couple of times by some other people who are well known for talking on this topic. And it's very, very important to recognize that what happens in many of these studies is that it's just sort of a claim in the methods sections, and it's kind of hard to know because I've never seen any video documentation of to what extent this is really the truth, and it is a subjective thing that the sets are taken to failure. So basically, then you have a singular unit of a set taken to failure that you can manipulate quantitatively as an independent variable in the studies. 5 sets, 10 sets, 15, 20, 30, 45, whatever it may be. So it's so much easier to manipulate as a variable and deal with statistically, and you don't have to consider the psychology. And exercise physiologists are renowned for thinking of the brain in the context of exercise as a kind of a black box. It's just up there like doing its thing, and we just don't kind of look the other way. There's a guy from South Africa named Tim Noakes who is an exercise physiologist. He's done some really cool basic exercise physiology stuff, but he's the last few 5-10 years maybe of his career, he's dug into this idea that really the brain and the central nervous system is the governor of exercise performance. He's got some really well thought out, well documented articles that people can find on PubMed, on Medline, PubMed.com or scholar.google.com. They'll find these with Timothy Noakes, Noakes. And there's so much going on there. And so back to the volume idea is like, what does it really mean to train to failure? And so that is something that you could just sort of like, okay, they train to failure. And then if you look, I know you've heard this criticism because I've levied it, and I've heard it levied by probably Lyle McDonald. I know he's probably the one who said it as loudly as anyone, and other people, is that if you look at like what happened in Brad's infamous study, is like someone trying to carry out that number of sets, 5 sets to squats to failure, and 5 sets of bent over rows, and 5 sets of everything to failure with those 90-second rest intervals that they did. That would be a recipe for rhabdomyolysis. That would just be, that would be absolutely utter destruction, and for almost anyone who really, really trains hard. So that's not something that could be done for many people. So there's an issue there, which has been gone into, and that's, we won't do that aspect of the mental masturbation. But when it comes to what I think you were getting at with natural trainees, or people who want to focus on those aspects of training, is that yes, it's much easier to say, well, I'll just do more sets, and they know how hard they train. So let's say literally when they're doing a set of 10, and Eric Helms this was part of, I think, some of his dissertation research is, he's and the follow-ups to that, he's found that people will estimate their rep maxes, and when you actually direct them through and have them carry out a true set to failure, some people will get as many as 7 or 8 more reps. They can increase their number of reps by like 50% easily when you really get them to push. And personal trainers know this as well. You can have people that you go in the gym, and Tom Platz would do this with people. You can watch him do this. He likes, I think you'd say 5 more reps. Sometimes people say 3 more reps. So you have someone go to do a set, and they would do 12 reps, and if they were on their own, that'd be it. And if you have a trainer there, they say 3 more reps. Well, they'll crank out 3 more reps, and sometimes form breaks down. The reps are not the same at the end, but we have much more left in the tank than most people recognize. And there is sort of an emergency reserve that it's hard to tap into when you're in a gym, with fluorescent colors around you, and they're playing 80s Madonna's on the radio. It's just like that doesn't make you want to push into that no man's land where you would be an absolute. I mean, it's almost a social faux pas, I think, for some people to push so hard like that in the gym. It's very rare that you go into a gym, in most gyms, and even in a gym that's pretty hardcore. You like, there's a gym here in town that I just trained at yesterday, and a lot of competitors, but I don't go in there because I notice this, because I've been to some gyms where this is happening, and you can sense like this is a fucking bunch of animals. Like these people, you don't get in the way. You walk around. You stay out of their space, because that space is sacred around that bar, around that machine. There is a vibe in there that is just unspeakable. And even in gyms where you have a lot of kind of advanced people, you don't see people training that hard. So back to your overanalyzer scenarios, like, okay, so you can say, well, what I want you to do is do something that, I want you to put yourself through absolute agony. I want you to suffer in a way that you've never suffered before. What you're going to have to do is you're going to have to go through hell in order to get this muscle mass by pushing your sets beyond where you ever pushed them before. You're going to have to go way past your normal comfort zone, where you may have 2 or 3 reps in reserve, really, if you pushed. And we're going to instead, so that's option A, like, go and hold a flame to your hand. You're going to do 30 sets in your workout total. Those last 3 or 4 reps are basically, or like 2 or 3 reps are like holding a flame to your hand, where you just want to do everything to get your hand out of that fire. That's like literally what that might mean to those people. Whereas I just heard Jordan say this in an interview that I heard. I can't remember which podcast he was on, but like that's his favorite part of the day. I know exactly what he means. Like that's what I'm looking for. When I go into the set, I'm looking for that holy shit. Like, I just had a conversation with God, and she told me to get back in there and get some more reps. That's kind of where you want to go if you kind of have some loose screws in your head, like Jordan and I do, and lots of other people. So there's that option. Or you say, well, each of your sets will just be as you've done before. We're not going to actually literally ask you to stress yourself too much. You're just going to add volume. And that's a much more sane approach. You can just do more sets of what you've already done. And that is, without a doubt, that is a possible, it's a way to produce overload. Absolutely, 100%. There's no doubt about that. But that's just a much more agreeable, I think, psychologically speaking, a much more agreeable proposition for most people. It's much less animalistic. It's much more logical. It's much easier to quantify. You go in the gym and if you have a crappy day, you definitely don't want to dwell on it. But you don't want to write down in your logbook. And I've done this before for myself. Pushed out on this set. That's a nice thing. You look back in your logbook. So what I do last time? Oh shit! I only got 6 reps, and I wrote pushed out. That fires you up for the next time. So So it's like literally the training harder versus doing more volume with the same level of effort are almost like they're two. It's like almost a dichotomy in terms of the two different possibilities. They're in different quantum realms, literally, for many people. Because like one requires one mindset and the other requires a different mindset, and it's not really that distinct. We're not talking X's and O's here, but still, I think there's something to say for the notion I think you're bringing forth that it's easier scientifically to manipulate the volume in that sense, because we don't have to deal with what happens? What do you do? I mean, I would love to see this study, but what do you do if you let's say you go and you're doing, progressive overload during the course of your 8, 10, 12, 16-week study, whatever it may be, ideally longer, of course, and you get to the end of the study and supposedly everyone's taken their sets to failure. And then you bring the subjects back in and you have to, maybe you could do this with a machine where they can't see the load. Like a selectorized leg extension or something like that, where they don't know how much weight is on the pin is lifting, where the pin is at to lift the load, and you just have someone take your set to failure, and then, but in this case, then you have people encourage them after to do more reps. Like we're going to do kind of a post test or something like that, and you find that holy shit, we were supposedly taking all these sets to failure, but when we go in and we actually test them differently, we find that some people, they don't get any more reps than we would have expected. Like we finished, this was about what they were getting at the end of their training. They didn't, maybe they had a little overreach and they got 1 or 2 more reps. And there's some people who are doubling their reps when we actually were yelling and screaming at them and encouraging them. So then it's like, holy crap, our unit of training dose is unknown. And I've actually created my own segue into this thing I was going to talk about in relation to training volume. So it would almost be like, you think you were testing the differences between 1, 2, and 3, or 2, 4, and 6 aspirins per day on, headache or, some sort of pain-related measurement and side effects. And instead you find out holy shit, our aspirins they're not dosed the same. Some of them are 325 milligrams, and some of them are just more than a baby aspirin, and they're all different. We don't have a standardized dose in the form of that unit, which we call a set, because some people were training literally to failure, and then some people weren't. They literally had many reps in reserve. They had tons of reps in the tank. So that you won't see that happen, because it's just mean, that would really, you could shoot your own study in the foot if you did that. I'd love to see someone do it. That would be a really honest scientific approach. Ideally, obviously, you have the same, people giving the same instructions. You standardize the level of encouragement that you give, because that can vary tremendously. That can definitely impact performance, and how much your experimenters, are they standing there with their lab coat on, and they've got their pencil protector and their lab coat and their clipboard, and they're just simply, okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, execute your set. Very good. Okay, we'll have 2 minutes starting the clock now. Let's move over to the leg press. And they just, like, if you could be just totally neutral, like an automaton, just basically guiding them from place to place, or you could be going bonkers and trying to get maximal effort. Totally different scenarios.
Yeah. On the failure thing, it's cool that people are hearing this from you, because I've been actually talking about this very thing a number of times when I did those volume videos, that I'm not someone who is going to get worked up by a study like that. Like, I also don't personally quite understand why Lyle McDonald is so annoyed by this study. I think because, like you said, it's not meant to provide practical recommendations. It's just there to show a particular dose-response relationship. And I've always said that from that perspective, these studies are completely legitimate. But my only sort of criticism or issue with some of the scientists that have been involved with this study, and some other content producers and researchers who have been discussing this study, is that it seems like they don't quite recognize just how important it is to actually clarify whether they truly mean failure when they say failure. Because it's not like it's just something that you can just insert in there. Like, yeah, so we had this study, it ran for 16 weeks, we had 30 participants, average age was this and that, and yeah, they were training to failure. It's like, wait, hold on. It's like, were they really training to failure? Like, to the point where they were shaking under the bar and they would have dumped it onto them if someone didn't help out? Or was it like, when they felt like it was getting tough, then they stopped? And it's fine. Like, that is also fine. If that meant 2 reps away from failure, or 3 or 4, it's still fine, because it still shows that dose-response relationship. But there's a really, really big difference. And sure, does that also mean that for previous studies on volume, that criticism also applies? Sure. Like, when it showed that 10 sets was the upper end, it could very well apply to that study as well. And then this study shows that, yes, under those circumstances, doing 45 sets a week could be viable. But if they were actually training to failure, then that would mean that for someone who is not training to failure and only stops, 1 or 2 rep away from failure, then, like, what would be the ideal volume for them? Like 70 sets, So these things are very important to clarify. And one last thing on this, sorry for the long monologue.
No.
Is that there have been a couple of studies also this year, or this past year, that have come out and showed negative effects from very high volumes.
Barballo study,
Yeah, that one, for example. And some of the scientists that have been involved with that study were, I think, James Fisher and Steele. I don't know if both of them were, but the studies that have showed negative effects from higher volumes were always involving some of these guys like Fisher and Steele, and those are within the HIT, very high intensity, low volume training camp. And that's important, because if you look at training sessions that these people conduct, then you will actually see people there that are truly training to failure and that are like shaking under the bar, and that's true concentric failure. And I just find it too accidental that the studies that these people were involved with actually showed like 20 sets or something, or 10 even, as the upper limit of training volume. So clarifying that and standardizing that is really, really freaking important if you actually want to demonstrate concrete numbers as the upper limit of training volume. So that would be my rant.
I absolutely agree with you. And as you were saying that, it was really occurring to me, even perhaps more so than it has in the past, is that quantifying and testing the validity of what is basically kind of a unit of stress here, the set taken to failure, is something that, a good scientist knows to do from experimental procedural standpoint. Literally, you would, like, for instance, like, there's also so many examples of this, things that the listeners, I'm sure, have heard about or know about. But for instance, if you do like DEXA for body composition, it's kind of well known, and it's been the subject of many, many studies now. If you look in the DEXA literature, comparing the different manufacturers in terms of the body composition estimates that you get compared to maybe a 4-component model or a MRI or CT or hydrostatic weighing or skin folds or whatever it may be. But they'll compare like lunar and hologic, or maybe a GE scanner, some of the main scanners, and you find differences that are there. So and the differences or the errors relative to some standard measure, whatever your validation criterion might be, can differ depending on the body fat percentage. And I won't go on this for too long, but you might find that one DEXA, I'm just making this up now, but one particular DEXA unit will tend to overestimate body fat percentage compared to your standard measurement, whereas the other manufacturers' DEXA will tend to underestimate. So the error at low percentage of body fats, and you might find the opposite to be the case when you go to high levels of body fat. So that's like something that scientists have like dug into, and they're well aware of that. Like you can't just compare, say you can't like do a study with at multiple centers and use different DEXA units from different manufacturers and presume that you don't have consistency in your measurement there. So across studies, when we're talking about maybe Brad's lab versus the Barhalo lab, those folks you just mentioned, Barbalo lab, then you've got basically a unit of stress here, the unit that's being manipulated as the independent variable, the number of sets taken to failure, is not standardized. So it's almost like, imagine like, let's make it even more kind of concrete and like, head shaking is like, imagine if like scales, like people have gone and weighed in. Sometimes I've seen some awful scales when I weighed in for bodybuilding shows, like this, it'd be like the health-o-meter scale they got at Walmart like 15 years ago that, weighs you at 5 pounds less than what you weighed on your home scale. It's like, that scale is not right. Well, imagine if the scales, hadn't been zeroed and balanced and calibrated. There's kind of a calibration issue here in terms of the stress that's imposed, because this is a psychometric type of phenomenon. Like what it really means to train to failure is something that is just sort of like tossed out there. But there are ways in which you could quantify this, and this would be like literally a complete research train. Like Jeremy Lenicky is someone who's done a magnificent job of really digging in and teasing apart a lot of the blood flow restriction related literature and what that does in terms of the responses and the adaptation and all sorts of aspects of that training model. So someone could literally probably create, a pretty strong research line looking into like, what is it, how can we actually, provide a sort of a validity measure of what it means to train to failure, so we can ensure that is actually the case. And can you use EMG, for instance? Can we track EMG over the course of a set to failure? And, if we find that there is an agreement with bar velocity or angular velocity, if it's like a knee extension or something like that, and EMG signal that corroborates that failure rep, and we find that agreement in those 3 measurements with the person's subjective sense that there's failure, and we can apply any type of encouragement or other psychological strategy to try to get more reps of the person, and we can't do so, and we still get the corroboration with those physiological measures like the EMG or the biomechanical measures like the bar velocity. Then I'm making this up really off the top of my head, but those sorts of things could be investigated so that we have a standardized, like literally we put our subjects through the Smith and Jones test for training to failure. And we found on these 3 lifts of the 8 that we used in our training study, they met the criteria. And those were the subjects that we included. And we left the rest of them out. They have to do this, for instance, in when you do swimming studies in rats or in mice. A lot of them will just, or actually a better example is treadmill running. So you can do endurance training studies with rats and mice, and the way they do that, it's not my favorite thing to explain, but they put them on a treadmill with an incline or what have you, and they start them running, and they keep them running because if they don't, there's a shock grid at the bottom of the treadmill. It's like the old school way to do it. And some of the rats or some of the rodents just say, screw it, I'd rather be shocked than run. And they'll just like, zzz. Well, those don't get included. They don't obviously, like if the animal doesn't actually run on the treadmill, it's pretty clear that they don't get included in the subject pool. They don't get, tested for whatever, they're trying to examine as far as an endurance adaptation, speed or velocity or whatever it may be, because they're non-runners. There's some animals that won't swim. Like if you want to get like a swimming test, like how long can they swim around like a barrel of water? Some rodents will just hold their breath and they'll dive bomb. They'll go down to the bottom and they'll bounce back up. Well, that's not what you want. So they get excluded. So you could literally come up with the same sort of scenario for excluding people who are hard trainers, not so hard trainers, those who meet the criteria that have been formulated over the course of validation studies to examine, who can train to failure and who cannot. We want to see these various things happening. At least gives us some idea. There is a study that I wrote an entire article about. It's on Elite FTS. The name of the article is, but the study it's done in the 60s. It's published in Journal of Applied Physiology, and the researchers are Ikai and Steinhaus. IKAI and Steinhaus, so maybe a Japanese and a German researcher. Anyway, the study was entitled something like psychological factors that influence the expression of human muscular strength. And they did some shit which you literally probably couldn't get a human subjects committee to approve these days. They had people do an isometric elbow flexion test, so basically an isometric curl. And they wanted to basically examine various things that would sort of disinhibit, so remove the inhibition of human strength. So they tested them just like with normal, like, okay, sit down in the lab and I want you to pull. Let's get your maximal voluntary contraction, elbow torque. And then they intoxicated them with alcohol. They gave them amphetamines. They screamed at them, like literally, ah! Like just scared the shit out of them. They had a starter pistol, like you'd use, to start off a 100-meter dash, a gun with a loud bang, and they shot that off unexpectedly next to their ears, and they actually hypnotized them. And they found to varying degrees that all of these things enhanced the strength expression. And I mean, the coolest thing about this study, and this is published in Journal of Applied Physiology, which is a highly regarded journal. And they took one of the people that they tested was like a world-class weightlifter, I think they call it, something like that. Someone who was fairly highly trained and he had the highest strength values, et cetera, et cetera. And he wasn't very impacted by these interventions, the screaming and the alcohol, et cetera, because presumably he had learned how to disinhibit over the course of years of training. Or maybe he was just naturally inclined that way, and that's why he became a weight trainer or a weightlifter, as they called him. And they hypnotized him, and he got a greater expression of strength. And they actually they documented this. The hypnotist took someone who they thought was the least inclined to be hypnotized. I think I'm getting this right. And this is literally, I could pull up the study and read it to exactly what it says in the methods section. But in order to document that their hypnosis was effective, they told this person who was hypnotized under the influence of hypnosis, so to speak, that the hypnotist is now going to touch a hot poker to your hand, but it will heal up in the next couple of days. So here it goes. And he took the backside of a pen, maybe the rubber eraser on a pencil, and touched that to the guy's hand. But under hypnosis, he thought it was a hot poker, and his hand blistered. At least that's what it says in the methods section. So I know of absolutely no physiological mechanisms that would create a blister without the actual cellular disruption that would come from the heat. Like there was no, like, it's like saying we're going to cut your hand now, and you just like make a motion with the knife, and all of a sudden there's a cut in the hand. Like he just touched a pen to him, and the guy got a blister. There was no hot poker. So that's like pretty good. That's in the scientific literature. I know it's pretty woo-woo, but if you look at the basic findings of that study, there's all sorts of things that are involved there, which will dictate strength and how hard we can push under the duress of extreme exercise. And that is, it's from a scientific perspective, I think it's good science to, now that we're seeing the things like the discrepancy, for instance, between what you see in Brad's most recent study with the 45 sets versus like the Barbalo study. There's the more recent one that came out with men where they use the term ceiling effect in their title. And it was like basically 5 sets actually seemed to be the best over the long haul 5 or 10 sets per week. If you look at most of the plots for most of the muscles that they examine the size of. So that's a gigantic range. Something's going on there. Like, so what I wanted to, the only, I bet I probably triggered some thoughts. Have you got anything to say to that? Because I've got a little.
No, go ahead. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. So the thing, and you brought it up with the Barbalo studies, is that really we've got a stress here, and you can think of exercise as a hormetic stress. We don't typically do this, but so are you familiar with that term, hormesis?
Yeah, it's when your body is adapting to a stress and
Kind of like the hormetic, the notion of hormetic stress is that there's an inverted U dose response curve. So for a smaller amount of the stress, you will get a given, like, let's say, a positive adaptation. And so that's a good thing. And then at some point, there'll be an optimal amount of stress for evoking the largest adaptation. And then when you have more and more of that stress, then you end up having a negative adaptation. And you can actually have a maladaptation too, where in this case, it would be akin to overtraining. So you can give like vitamin C is good in small amounts. There's an optimal amount of vitamin C, and then too much will actually counters. This is all connected to hormesis, in particular hormesis stress. Here's a better example. People may not know this, but you can actually give small amounts of radiation that will increase the cellular ability to withstand further radiation doses. It increases the ability to detoxify from radiation. So people talk about snake bites. People who will sort of inoculate themselves to snake bites by using snake venom. Obviously, if you just like went all out and went in for a full bite right off the get-go, you could end up dying depending on the venom in the snake. But smaller amounts will sort of create an inoculation effect. So there's this notion of hormesis, is that there's an inverted U. There's an optimal amount, there's a less than optimal amount, and then if you go too far, you can have less than optimal amounts and even amounts that will cause a maladaptation. So reduce your ability to withstand the stress. And so volume is sort of like, it's the dose that you get of exercise. And if you look at those Barbalo studies, you see a hormetic-like dose response curve. That's an inverted U. So like in the men's study, and it's too bad we don't have video. You could throw up these plots. Maybe you could send the links. You can. I don't know if I have the Barbalo study, but I don't know if you can get it. I'm not sure how I got it. I have a pre-publication manuscript. I'm not sure where I came up with it, but I found it someplace. But the plots in there aren't great. They've got these weird plots in those that don't. You can see them, but you have to magnify them quite a bit. And you see that of like 5 or 10 sets, and about 10 sets seems to be the sweet spot in the women's study, is where you're getting the best adaptation. And then beyond that, you're not getting as much muscle growth. And in the men's study, the cool thing that they did is they measured muscle growth over the course of the study. It was several months long. I think they had like 3 measurements, a pre and then 2 middle and a post measurement. And you can see that there's an effect of time as well. So you're getting some growth from the first to the second measurement, and then over the course of time, there's a regression. So that's something that we don't often take into account. That's sort of a very important side note here, is that what you see in the snapshot of an 8-week study in terms of adaptation to the training doesn't mean that is necessarily going to continue for the next 8 weeks. It may have been that's basically what maybe Mike Israetel would call the max recoverable volume. I don't want to interpret his terminology for that 8-week period, but if you tried to do that for 16 weeks, that would be too much. You have to have a deload in there of some sort. So the volume of sets is like the dose, like the milligrams that you have. But resistance exercise has various kinds of drugs that you can give, so to speak, in order to dose this adaptation that we seek in terms of hypertrophy. You can do heavy training, you can do light load training, you can do training that is of high effort. So you can think of sort of, if you look at an individual set, you can actually say, what was the potency of that set? And that's what we've been talking about in training to failure, or really training to failure. So a highly potent set would be one where someone trains to absolute failure, and they really train to failure. Like you held a gun to their head, as they really literally did in the study that Ikai and Steinhaus. It wasn't a real gun. They weren't going to shoot him, but it it was a starter pistol that scared the bejesus out of him. There's no more reps coming. That's a highly potent set. So you could look at the extent of effort as related to the potency. So if you take, let's say your dose is a set, or so your drug is aspirin, you could have a baby aspirin, which is maybe like a wimpy set or a warm-up set, really doesn't do much. Or maybe it's a set where you have lots of reps in reserve. And like, yeah, if you take, you have to do like 10 baby aspirin to get what you get out of just 3 regular aspirin. So 10, easy sets could kind of make up for, the lack of effort, so to speak, because you've basically taken in enough of the drug of exercise, so to speak. Dose yourself up with multiple sets, but with minimal effort. It's not quite as simple as that, but I'm trying to sort of build this sort of paradigm. So the potency too is a function of the mind-muscle connection. So, we've got, I'm not a pharmacologist, but literally you're providing the stress to the entire body, but you want to bring that stress to the muscle that you're trying to evoke the growth out of. So you want to direct, let's say if you're taking the aspirin for muscle soreness, you'd want ideally that aspirin to be directed towards the muscle. If you're taking the aspirin for a headache, that's where you want the aspirin to go. So the extent to which you're dosing the body as a bodybuilder, i.e. you're training the muscle that you're trying to make grow rather than just the entire muscle or the muscles that are involved, accessory muscles or whatever else, muscles that maybe shouldn't be involved. You're throwing your back into a biceps curl, for instance. That is not dosing. That's not a more potent stimulus necessarily for the muscle because you're using sloppy form. You've got a poor mind-muscle connection. You can also make sets more potent, potentially, or sort of change the nature of them. Maybe almost as now we're talking about comparing non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. We're comparing naproxen or ibuprofen or aspirin or acetaminophen, which really isn't even a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. We're talking about we can sort of change things if you start adding intensification techniques, doing drop sets, doing cluster sets, those sorts of things. And then you've got the overlapping effect. And then you can go into all the other variables that are talked about. But the basic idea is that you've got a dose, which is the number of sets, and you've got potency. So if you just take 10 aspirin, you have to ask yourself, were those 10 baby aspirin or those 10 full dose aspirin? And were those aspirin that went right to the muscle, or did I just dose myself with a bunch of the drug that's going to cut in my recovery abilities? So the hypertrophy drugs, so to speak, come about. You can also sort of see them in terms of specificity of training. High loads give you greater strength, and we know, and there are data out there. People sort of there's several good studies. The best one is probably with rugby players who increased squat strength over like a year or two of training, and there was a correlation, I think it was like 0.8 between the increase in squat strength and increase in fat-free mass in these rugby trainers who were doing weight training to increase muscle mass for rugby. There are some other studies showing decent correlations between getting stronger and gaining muscle size. And high load training gives you greater muscle strength. So that's a little bit different in terms of an hypertrophy drug in the form of a high load set. The low load sets are going to give you more of a muscular endurance effect. One of the things I asked Brad in that podcast that we had him on for was if anyone, because of course you presume, progressive overload is being applied in these studies. So you literally have performance measurements over the course of these studies with these trainees that are doing the low load training and the high load training. So you could say an obvious question for me to ask would be like, so did the guys who got the strongest in the high load training get the biggest? Did they get the greatest strength gains? And also we've seen that in other studies that have looked at that in particular. But what about the low load? So if you're doing like sets of 25 to 35 or what have you, 20 to 30, do you see that the people who increase the load the most in those high rep sets, so their performance goes up the most, are those the ones who get the most muscle growth as well? So does loading during low load training or the progressive increase in load during the low load training predict muscle growth? So those are some sort of other features, and there's more to it, but I'll let you interject.
Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, then please once again consider dropping a 5-star rating on iTunes. It would mean a lot to me and it would be truly helpful. And if you're interested in more cool stuff, then you could visit my YouTube channel. If you type in Sustainable Self-Development Podcast there, or even SSD Podcast, it will come up. And if you're interested in working together with me, then you can check out the Calendly link in the show description. There you can book a free call with me. We can hop on that call, chat about your goals, challenges, determine if we are a good fit. And if that is the case, then we could be working together going forward to get you to the results that you want. So that's all I had to say for today. I hope you enjoyed this once again. And with that, see you next time.